This is the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm Richard McColl, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. This is episode 582. We have Emily on the line in Medellin, so it's a joint podcast. And our very special guest is Nicolas Forsans. He is in, well, I don't know exactly where he is, but he's the professor at Essex, University of Essex, Latin America specialist, focus on political economy, migration, and the business social justices intersection. He's also got a Substack, which is excellent. I highly recommend it. Latin America Sin Filtro. And he puts out a remarkable amount of content about Latin America there. So, Nicolas, first time on the podcast, but I know you're a listener, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Emily. Nice to meet you again. Thank you.
It's true. It's been a while since we met in London in like Bloomsbury or somewhere around there. Yeah, there we go. You see, the last time, 3 or 4 years ago now. Anyway, Emily's there, and Emily came up with the idea of having Nicolas on the podcast, and the idea is that we talk about sort of the issues in Latin America and the issues affecting urbanism, cities, and so on. Nicolas, you've done a lot of work regarding violent crime, extortion, inequality, gentrification. You have anecdotes about these things. Perhaps you could jump in a little bit and just say, can we start with the situation in Latin American cities? Because, these are always known as sort of trouble hotspots, I think.
That's right. I mean, and that's what's fascinating, I think, about Latin America. There is so much disparity in urban life in Latin America. The first thing I think to emphasize, and I think it's widely known everywhere, Latin America is a very, very violent region. It concentrates, I think, 8 out of every 10 homicides in the world that comes from Latin America. In the top 50 most violent cities in the world, 40 of them are based in Latin America and the Caribbean. And obviously, a number of issues are all related in Latin America. There is no violence without poverty. There is no poverty without inequality. There is no inequality without informality. There is no informality without exclusion, social exclusion and discrimination. And all these find its roots in the history of the region and the histories of different countries. And I think that's what fascinated me when I started looking at Latin America. I did my PhD, that was a long time ago now, on the North American Free Trade Agreement. Okay, so USA, Mexico, and Canada. That was about, 30 years ago, something like that. But when I look back at Latin America, I find it's a very vibrant continent. It's a relatively young continent. And there are so many issues that collide, which means that you can never be bored of Latin America. If you're an academic and you want to understand Latin America, you've got so many variations in all those patterns across regions. Central America is different from South America. Even within Latin America, the Andes is quite different from countries in the South when it comes to urbanization, when it comes to informality, inequality, and poverty. So I think that's what brought me to Latin America in the first place.
I want to jump in and say, when you talk about the history, are we talking pre-colonial, or are we talking bringing in the colonial history, let's say, Latin America, largely Spanish, of course, Portuguese, and a smattering of English and French in various places. But where are we sort of starting when you say the history of the region?
I think it's very convenient to start from the process of colonization, okay? Because I'm not an historian. So I don't have great deal of interest in going back to thousands of years. I think colonization brought a number of issues in Latin America. The dominance of European colonial powers, who set their rules and excluded a lot of indigenous communities. Okay, and you know it in Colombia, not just in Colombia. And then we also have a continent, I think, that has, because of its history, has been marked by decades of dictatorships. And those dictatorships brought repressions, human rights abuses, and in many cases, illegitimized violence as a way to legitimize, to solve conflict. And I think that all these things are historical. Similarly, in Colombia in particular, you've got the conflict that goes back to the 1950s, 1940s, La Violencia, okay? And then everything that came out after that period, up to the 2016 peace agreement. And in Colombia, you can see how transnational crime organizations, the FARC, the ELN, and many others, how they shaped the country. And they shape it even to the present day, when you've got one of the pre-presidential candidates, only a few weeks ago, dying of his injuries as a result of an assassination attempt by a 15-year-old child. Okay, and all this, I think, produces effects, issues. In Colombia, there's a very low level of trust. People do not trust each other or one another. Okay, and all this find its roots in the history, an history which is led or marked by decades of violence, where you don't quite know when everybody sits in relation to every single issue. You've got a very polarized society now, and as you head to the next year's election, who knows what's going to happen? Okay, who knows?
I think something really interesting happened this week in terms of that, which is that Miguel Uribe Turbai's father, who is grieving not only his son but his wife from the 90s, who was killed in an attempt to rescue her from a kidnapping by the cartels. And then on the other side, we've had Ivan Cepeda announce his pre-candidature, his father having been killed by the military and the paramilitaries for his left-wing activism in the Unión Patriótica. The gravitational center of these two pre-candidacies is obviously Uribe. Cepeda has grown to fame around Álvaro Uribe, taking him on, accusing him of paramilitarism, and then obviously instigating the legal case in which he was convicted. And it was, in fact, or seems to have been, Álvaro Uribe who asked Miguel Uribe Turbai's father to run as a candidate for the Centro Democrático. So it's so polarized, but around kind of recent history, and like you say, the conflict, of which Álvaro Uribe, forms a very specific chapter. And I think that kind of does lead us into Latin American cities. Because I think if you're European, you have an idea of how a city is formed and the processes by which urbanization take place. And particularly in Colombia, a huge amount of urbanization has been spontaneous and driven by rural conflict. So we have a very specific type of city forming. You go to London and you see these enormous housing estates that were built for factory workers who lived in the countryside to bring them to London. That is simply not what happens in this region, right? People come and they build their own city. One of my favorite books about this is called The State Always Arrives Late. I can't now remember what that was in Spanish. El Estado siempre llega tarde. And that's a study of this phenomenon. So I'm wondering, Nicolas, how you think that form of urbanization, which again is recent, much more recent than a lot of urbanization in European countries or North American countries, creates the dynamics that then cause these issues of exclusion and violence and inequality.
The title of the book that you mentioned is actually quite an interesting title, because as I study Latin America from an outsider, I can see a lot of those issues in Latin America are related or ultimately linked to weak institutions and weak states. And I think if the state was stronger in Colombia and many other countries in the region, then we wouldn't have all the issues that we have in Latin America today, whether it's state capture by multinational firms or by organized crime, whether it is the lack of protection for informal workers. Okay. And to go back to the issue of urbanization, in Colombia in particular, we've had a significant wave of displacement from rural Colombia into urban Colombia. Most Colombians today live in cities, okay? Bogota, Medellin, Cali, and a few others. Most of them live there, a lot of them in informal settlements, okay? possibly with running water, possibly with electricity, possibly without it, or with stolen electricity from the neighborhood. Okay, and as a result of which, and for reasons that could be changed as through tax reforms in particular, those people are stuck in a poverty trap as a result of informal contracts, informal employment. If they don't work one day, they don't eat that day. And if you've got a family, okay, you know what the impact is on the rest of the family. But these issues don't have to be those type of issues. The problem is, in Colombia, like in other Latin American countries, you've got an element of state capture by the elite, what we call the elites. Okay, and I think tomorrow on my Substack, there will be a piece coming out around state capture by the elites. Who are the elites? How does that work? And why do they capture the state? Okay, and why is the state unable to take itself out of that of their hands? And I think tax reform could go a long way towards providing opportunities, because ultimately what drives violence, poverty, inequality, informality is the lack of economic opportunities. Okay? And linked to that are those young people, like this 15-year-old child who killed Uribe Turbay, okay, tempted by gangs. Gangs provide a way out of misery, a way out of poverty for themselves, but especially for their families. And I think that's quite significant. And we could do something about it with the right policies and the right people.
And not just that, but they also provide a type of statehood. And this book does a really interesting job of tracking the process by which the people arrive and do what they can. And then informal powers, usually armed groups, come in and they provide, quote unquote, their security, the specific type of protection and security. And I'm sure we'll get onto that. But also, they have the know-how of organizing groups. And we have the Juntas de Acción Comunal. You do get grassroots community power. And I'm really interested to know how you guys think that those might be able to go some way into countering these other two powers that we're looking at, which is, captured state power and illegal armed power. Can the community provide its own forms of organization that push back against this? Or do we just need better statehood, better taxes, and more economic opportunities?
I think I'll just say a few words. I'm not an expert in this, but I think grassroots communities have a role to play. And I think I saw it when I studied gentrification of Latin American cities. We could see in Buenos Aires attempts by grassroots communities to take ownership of the problem and work with local governments in order to protect tenants from those impacts. But when you are dealing with organized crime, that's very different, I think. The state, even if people in Latin America distrust the state and politicians and those in position of power, they still tend to trust them more than gangs who impose a tax on their daily life, or what we call extortion, which can take many forms. So I think there is a limit, I think, to what grassroots communities can do in the absence of a strong state. Yeah. So that's why, to me, I look at it as I think it's about strengthening the state, strengthening institutions, getting rid of corrupt police and immigration officers. It's about getting rid of corrupt judges. It's about going back to prisons and making prisons what they should be. Not as a headquarter for criminal organizations. I think there are lots of things the state should do. It doesn't have the capability to do it because of lack of income. Latin American countries recover very little taxes relative to European countries. And because of that, there is less money in the pot, and so it can't be spent the way it would be spent in Europe. Richard, maybe you had some thoughts on grassroots. I'm not going to interview.
Well, I don't think I'm an expert on this. either, but I have spent some time with the Juntas de Acción Comunal, but in rural Colombia, in an area that was incredibly penetrated politically and violently by the FARC, and they were also very much infiltrated by the FARC, and so there was also a huge amount of state suspicion towards them, and of course the military didn't trust them. We spent a week listening to them and seeing the activities, and despite, let's say, the elements of criminality, which were quite clear, the basis of these juntas were correct. They were with the best interests of the most humble, the farmers, the smallholders in this area on the border between Caquetá and Meta. It was about representation. It was about investment, not massive investment, but just trying to deliver somewhat on basic human rights. I think that's when it's, to try and formalize some of that informality, to try even the most what seems so trivial, not even paving a road, just making a road passable in the rainy season so that the smallholder could get his can of milk to a road to sell it. Things like that. And so I think there are immediate benefits to the juntas, but I think it's a very, very long-term project that can always be disrupted by, again, the weakness of these institutions, and of course co-opted by criminal gangs who want their cut, and of course legitimate state actors who also want their cut. And I'm not naming names, and I'm not naming things that I don't want to get myself in trouble. But I think there's also another element, and I was waiting at the very beginning there, how long it was going to take you to bring in the elites, because it didn't take long. And it does seem to be something we flip back to all the time, not just in Colombia. I mean, there are 15 families here, I think, who might just be everyone, and they control everything. I don't think they listen to this. I think we're okay.
I don't feel like naming them either.
But it's shocking to me.
True.
This shocking.
But it's like you say, Richard, it's everywhere. And you see, particularly on social media, you see a lot of direct solidarity mechanisms. So it's people saying, oh, I can't pay my rent this month, and a bunch of people from their activist network transfer them $10, and those things are transformative and amazing. But much like these juntas, we're talking about small amounts of power being shared. Well, there's an enormous body which should be helping, and we're all donating our £5 to UNICEF, and there's like Musk and Bezos, and you know what I mean? Like it feels piffling.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of our international listeners are going to know what that word means, but ta-da! That's how it feels.
If I try and put it into perspective, Latin American democracies are very young. Okay, they're at best 200 years old. Okay, really. And when I moved to this country, in the United Kingdom, that was about nearly 30 years ago now. The political environment was very different, and the elites in the UK were in bed with the Conservatives. And I arrived at the time of John Major. Okay, so that was 30 years ago. And you had scandals in politics, exactly. You had big media tycoon in the UK who ruled the show, okay? They're the ones who, they had their contacts in government and they could do whatever they wanted, okay? That wasn't that long ago that we started bringing it to an end. And now through transparency and all those type of things, we managed to make democracy, if not better, at least a little bit more, I don't know, the word might be a little bit more fairer, maybe, where the elites are separated from political parties. Colombia and Latin America, those democracies are much younger. It will happen eventually, but it will take time.
So there's hope.
It's funny. The US, for example, is quite an old democracy. Not in global terms, but certainly in regional terms. And you've still got the elites with their fingers pretty deep in a bunch of pies that I would rather they didn't have their fingers in. And these wild inequalities globally, I think, seem shocking to us, but you're quite right. They are. That level of inequality has been common in this region since its inception, and the type of colonizing processes that it was subject to. One thing I read on your Substack recently that really interested me, Nicolas, was your piece on extortion. Because I think when we're talking about the ability of people to make a living, to predict how their day is going to go, to know that the road is open, to know they'll make a certain amount of money, to be able to plan their lives, extortion is really key in that. And you referred to it as low profile, high impact, which I think is really interesting. How does it stay so hidden, I suppose, is the major question, because it's so common here.
It's common across Latin America, really. It stays hidden because those criminal organizations trade on fear. Okay, they don't have to kill anyone. The only thing they need to do is come up with a credible threat that if those people won't pay, they will be killed. Okay, and what impunity rates whenever someone goes to the police, 95, 97%. So even if you go to the police and report it, nothing will happen. So why report it in the first place? And because of that, we don't have any data or good data, reliable data on the scale of extortion. Another problem, actually, when I looked at the data sources, you can either source data from the Ministry of Defense in Colombia, or you can from Las Fiscalía. And they will plot data on extortions for the year 2024. You've got a gap between the two. The trend is similar. Okay, the trend is similar or mostly rising, but the data are not the same. So we don't have good data. Why? Because it stays hidden. Why does it stay hidden? Because it's not worth reporting, or because people fear they will be worse off by reporting it than by not reporting it. The extortion takes different forms. In Colombia, you've got mostly la vacuna, or you've got the gota a gota. Okay, but extortion it can either be a one-off payment. Okay, in Guatemala, so one-off payment, or it can be a regular payment, daily, weekly, monthly, annually. And for this one, they've got a different word. It's called la renta. Okay, so it's a tax. It's a tax on daily life. Okay, in the same way that you pay your annual tax to whatever. In this country, we pay tax to watch TV. Okay, you pay it once a month, direct debit. Okay, la renta is something quite similar in effect. It's so ingrained and it's so part of daily life that they don't even use the word extortion for it. Extortion is only used as for one-off extraction of money from the individual or from the business. So that's very interesting. And as I say, it stays hidden because there's no value in bringing it out in the open. And so what we see is like an iceberg. You've got the cases that are declared, and then you've got the majority of the other cases that sit underneath the iceberg and nobody knows they take place.
Do you sense it in Bogota, Richard? Are you,
no,
are
in
you aware of
Monpós.
businesses? Oh, in Monpós.
I get the calls.
Wow.
Several a year, and they're traced back to because we go to the police. Although on some occasions I would prefer not to, because sometimes I don't feel appropriately, let's say, considered by them. Oh, it's just a call from a prison in Barranquilla. Yeah, but you heard the message, because a lot of the time I don't answer phones, from invisible numbers, for example, and. Yeah, I mean, if they leave a message, it's the most grotesque, offensive message, usually threatening to rape and kill and what have you. So on occasion, we've taken those to the police, who then say, oh, yeah, this is Barranquilla, don't worry about it. It's like, yeah, but the damage, psychologically is done.
Yeah.
And we've not paid anything ever. I'm not going to say that, but it's there. Bogota, the extortion and the corruption. I mean, I think more than, I don't know if you want extortion. I see the vendors on the street vendors paying their cut. I've watched it. The guy who comes around with his briefcase every day, just down there on the Septima, as if he's buying a pack of cigarettes from the vendor. It's very clear. And when I was doing my studies downtown in Santa Fe, so a quite lawless part of Bogota, and that's when the Bronx still somewhat existed. So this sort of 4-block area of total criminality, everything you can possibly imagine. That backed onto the military recruitment building, and indeed there was a huge police station at one end. So why is this existing? Well, it doesn't take a genius to work out who's charging the entry and the exit. And when I stood there on the Calle 13, which used to be the old land entrance to Bogota, so when you talk about gentrification or when you talk about an expansion of a city, you can't do it in Bogota without looking at Calle 13, which passes by the old train station and everything else. And then I would watch the police, again, taking their cuts from, and they were largely Venezuelan youngsters who'd stolen phones. And they put cardboard boxes out, 3 p.m. in the afternoon, on the calle, in the middle, and put the phones out to be sold. And the police would come along and take their cut. And I watched this as well. And when the police raided with the SMAD, like the riot police would raid a shop that we'd know would be laundering, because how does a shop down there possibly make enough money selling phone cases to pay a rent? I mean, possibly. So they weren't paying off who they needed to pay off, and you'd see it. So you just see it. And
you
this comes back
to how to look, right?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the strong institutions, and it comes back to informality, and it comes back to everything. Really, it all circles back, and it's quite concerning.
It is, and I think.
Yeah. No,
sorry, Nicolas.
Go ahead, Emily. Go ahead.
I was just going to say here in Medellin, and this is a part of the Paisa culture to some degree, but I think it's true everywhere. Oh, lovely noise. Part of the, let's say, Comuna 13 tour that everyone does. And there's this like, Medellin is a transformed city. Here are some colorful buildings and some hip hop dancing. Your own tour guide is paying the vacuna at the end of that tour.
Mm-hmm.
And I live in the center of town. The bit in Medellin, basically, the further up the hill you go, the more armed group presence there is, in theory. I live, what in terms of Medellin is sea level, technically a couple of 1,000 feet above. But at the park that I used to hang out in, and now I have to say don't, you would hear, the old guy who sells the popcorn, you would just have an explosion where he's just had enough. And he's just yelling at this young guy who's come around to collect his cut. You can edit that out later, Richard, if you feel like it.
No, that's fine.
Just a lot of tensions. And this is a guy who, an older gentleman who in a fairer society would be retired and relaxing, who is selling popcorn and who is getting threatened by a young guy. And this is, the center, La Candelaria, we're talking downtown Medellin, where in theory the police would have the most control. This is where the roads can take a car everywhere. This is where you can, in theory, have access, where there are police centers everywhere. And I think there's a sense of those are the old days. And your eye is obviously trained, Richard. Nicolas, you're studying it academically. As soon as you're able to spot it, you see it. So like you say, it's an iceberg until you learn to swim, and then you can see the whole underneath bit.
Oh, very good, Emily.
I actually write for a living, so yeah, I do. I'm interested in this prison element that you've both mentioned, because I think what we're seeing also in this region is that the major gangs are now coming out of prisons. Ecuador, Venezuela, the PCC in Brazil. How is that happening? Because it is obviously a problem of prison management. How are we seeing that in all of these dynamics?
It's very easy. It doesn't take very much for it to be possible. The first thing it takes is the business of extortion is a low entry barriers business. All you need is a phone. It doesn't even have to be a smartphone.
Is this a how-to?
A phone. You need to be able to make a credible threat. You don't even have to prove membership of a gang. You can just make it up. Copycats are quite common, okay, and maybe that's why you got Richard, which is why they didn't come after you. And all it takes is sneaking the mobile phone in the prison, okay. And that's made possible because you've got overcrowding, so you don't have enough staff. And second, the staff is completely corrupt, okay? Because their life depends on it. But also, all the things I read about extortion, inmates are also extorted because surviving in a prison environment costs them money. They too need to buy protection from gang leaders in the prison, okay? So extortion is just, I mean,
Yeah.
however awful it is, and in particular for the people who are subject to that, okay? And when you talk about the microcredit, the gota a gota, which can lead to suicides and people having to close their business and family stress and the rest of it, it's awful. But it's such an ingrained part of daily life, even for the criminals themselves, okay? So what does it happen in prison? About a third of reported cases have been traced back to prisons in Colombia. Okay, that's based on studies that I've looked into it. I didn't come across any estimate for the turnover of extortion in Colombia, but we know from studies, the Global Financial Initiative study looked at the one in El Salvador and the Northern Triangle, okay, in the run-up to 2022. And the turnover across Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador was around $1 billion annually. Okay, $1 billion. Okay, that's a huge amount of money. So I don't know what it is in Colombia. It's widespread. Everybody in some form either is affected by it or knows someone who is impacted by it. And it can have tragic consequences. And obviously it takes, corrupt prison officers and police officers, as we discussed previously.
It's interesting, in your newsletter, Nicolas, I read that extortion complaints rose 300% in 2024.
In Barranquilla.
In Barranquilla, which is where you're saying you were called from, Richard.
Oh yeah.
So is there a problem with the prison system in Barranquilla? Are people actually reporting extortion more than they were before? Could that be what explains this stat?
I think it depends on how stories make their way to newspapers. I can see, if you look at the official data from Ministry of Defense and the Fiscalia, there's been a big increase in extortion in Bogota. 65% in 24 versus the previous year. So a big increase, but nowhere near, only in Bogota was the increase that high. In Antioquia, it actually went down a little bit in 2024 versus 2023. But remember, their data we can't rely on. They're only reported cases. So reported cases in Barranquilla went up 300%, but that doesn't tell us very much about the scale of extortion in Barranquilla as such. That's why if you do studies on the phenomenon, it's going to be very difficult to come up with proper estimates. Even the Fiscalia and the Ministry of Defense come up with different data sets for the same crime, really.
And these things are so difficult to study, aren't they, except anecdotally?
They are, that's right. And when you look at efforts, El Salvador, for example, what they try to do, what Bukele tried to do through a state of exception, I mean, we'll have to see what happens. In the short term, when I looked at the data, it seems like cases of extortions had almost disappeared. In 2 years? Almost disappeared. What remains at a huge price, and we know, and your listeners and will know about what comes out of the state of exception and mano dura type of policies or approaches to crime, human rights abuses and suspension of constitutional rights and the rest of it. In the short term, it has brought an end to extortion. If you're going to lock up 110,000 people in maximum security prisons, a lot of them without necessarily with a criminal background, a lot of them awaiting trial in a country where mass trials tend to be the norm. Of course, extortion is gonna come down. But at the same time, previous examples of mano dura policies, if anything, they strengthen the gangs. And they made the prison system the headquarters for gangs and their criminal activities. So let's see. When in other countries like Honduras, I think I wrote about it, I think that was last week or 2 weeks ago. Since 2022, November 2022, left-wing Castro, president of Honduras, has had a state of exception, which has been renewed 17 times. Okay, extortion hasn't disappeared. Okay, homicides hasn't gone down, and yet They suspended constitutional rights for people in Honduras. There have been cases of human rights abuses. So just because Bukele did it doesn't necessarily mean that his model can be exported, okay? And the effect of it can be replicated. So let's see what happens in the next few years. But I would be very doubtful unless you break that business model. The business model that underpins extortion is going to be very difficult to break it.
You have to wonder, or I certainly, because I'm working on a story about mercenarism and kind of repeated, recycled conflict dynamics and the same young men getting drawn in and out of them, I've become completely obsessed with the effects and ways in which you can traumatize a generation of young men. And you have to wonder, in the case of Bukele, those prisons are horrible. Those are not nice places to be for anybody. You put thousands of people into them. How are those people then going to cope with life when they get out? And I do, a lot of my work has regarded women at the moment. I'm talking to a lot of men, but, the women who then have to deal with these men, both at the domestic level and just in society, are going to suffer from the kinds of trauma that are being inflicted on these men.
Yeah.
These men themselves are, of course, suffering also. But, the ways that this shapes a society to incarcerate large groups of young men, you can see it in the US. It's incredibly fracturing to a society. And these crimes often get what Mark Grief talks about being distributed. Because if you can imprison anybody, the prejudices and biases in the police, in society as a whole, will then be enacted in that sphere, and you will end up repeating patterns of discrimination and inequality. And that's what we saw with the false positives here, right? A lot of that was people who were already the so-called false positives. I am doing air quotes, but for anyone listening, you can't see it, so I'm going to say air quoted false positives killings. Those reenacted the dynamics of exclusion and prejudice in society. So they become really pretty dangerous. And I'm wondering, having done a small amount of work on a museum exhibition about one of the barrios here in Medellin, the ways that inequality is repeated in a city, and the way that those dynamics of exclusion are repeated, kind of do relate to classism. And I think if we're talking about Latin America, that's a big issue, right? I mean, I'm English. I know we're hardly
yeah, but we know
we're hardly good on that front. But Colombia particularly is a very stratified city, and cities become cities within cities. I mean, Bogota is an amazing example of that. And how does that lock in? Are there parts of cities just being abandoned because of those people? Working class people are tarred with the brush of criminality a lot of the time, and the elites just kind of want to leave them behind and wall themselves in.
There's a staggering statistic. In Colombia, but in Latin America generally, it takes about 15 generations for a Colombian to move up the social class ladder. 15 generations. If you are born poor, what hope have you got of being able to escape from your poverty? The only hope I can see is by joining a criminal gang. Okay? And then you realize the appeal, however atrocious it is, and however risky it is for that person's life. Okay? But something has to be done about it. We need to create opportunities. We need to bring discriminations down. And it starts with a strong state. The problem in Colombia and elsewhere, I think, and Petro, there was a lot of hope. Okay? 3 years ago, a lot of hope. And it's been a wasted opportunity. Someone who had such a strong social justice agenda, finally rising to power, to have made a mess of it, right since the beginning. It's a shame, because those who will succeed him, especially from the right, okay? I don't know much about the candidates on the left or the pre-candidates on the left, but on the right, they're going to be the same powerful elite, okay? We will protect the elites. We will protect the businesses, okay? And they will just replicate the same system of discrimination and the patterns we've seen in Colombia since for a very long time, since the 1950s. Okay, and that is such a waste, what he's done with his premiership.
I'm going to jump in with a few things here. I think you're obviously 100% on that. I mean, then there was so much promise. But we sadly knew it was going to go that way because of the way Petro manages things. Having worked for him for 2 weeks, having worked for him for 2 weeks in the mayor's office, you could see it firsthand. But I think there's something I really want to bring up there, and it goes back to El Salvador, and of course, people in Colombia and the polarized situation of should we swing right or far right in Colombia? Let's say the Maria Fernanda Cabals, the Uribe, I can't remember his surname, but Miguel Uribe is further. Uribe Londoño, Paloma Valencia, Guerra, all of these, Vicky Davila. I mean, she presents herself as an outsider, but she's, we know where she is.
All the outsiders always right wing.
Yeah. But it's, they are going to talk again about the mano dura, the Uribista mano dura. And then they will say, oh, we need the Bukele model, which of course you can't transfer to Colombia because the situations are different. Yes, the causes, the issues are same, but this is a militarized society. And Bukele has weakened institutions for his own strength. So we see a repetition taking place with him working on the judicial system. But I just wonder when they replicate the same system of marginalization, again, we're strengthening criminality. And I see all these people as like Maria Fernanda Cabal and all of the others I spoke to, and Alvaro Uribe to a point, as the bagmen for the elites and big business within Colombia. Just acting on these fronts, and it worries me very much, especially as we did have so much promise. And I just wish that Petro would have gone, let's work on one thing and do it well, because it would have created change. But that's my pinko liberal look at these things.
Yeah, I think we're all somewhat on the same page with these things. And certainly there is, I think one of the problems with Petro is that there's a slight crustiness to his left-wingism that maybe isn't totally suited. I think it was Matt Yuki actually who called them sort of crusty corduroy wearing type socialists in an Economist piece, which is it's just slightly outdated. It's got a kind of comrade discourse. And like you say, Nicolas, the world has really changed and the majority of the country now lives in urban settings. So to be interested in coca, in campesino rights, in agricultural reform is great and important, but it's not the whole story. And the failure to modernize socialism, I think, is a part of the problem that we've seen here. Is it's not really adapted its discourse, partly because it's been stuck in opposition, particularly in this country, since like the 1800s or whatever. But there's certainly a management problem.
An interesting thing that came out, I think, last week, the latest Invamer survey, the poll of
Invamer,
yeah, exactly. What is stopping most the Colombians' concerns is insecurity and issues of public order. So no wonder there will be calls for a mano dura approach. Okay, yeah, we're just creating the conditions to make for it to happen. Okay, and then, but maybe we have to go through that process. If you remember the Latino Barometro, every year, people are willing to trade off security for democracy for security. They are willing to have less democratic space in exchange for more security. And we've seen it across the continent, and it's been a growing trend over the past 3 years. So
the past 50.
50, yeah.
I mean, there have always been people who support military juntas taking over when they feel that the threat of socialism is too great, or communism, or however it's being couched by the right or the military in that particular
And maybe
context.
This needs to happen for people to realize this is not the answer.
If Latin America hasn't learned that mano dura isn't the answer by now, I just don't know when it's going to learn. Like,
it's
we
the
have
same as
had.
the UK, obviously. I mean, you can see that if you follow the UK news, you know
Try
the
not
issues
to,
we've got around migration in particular and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You're just
It
feeding
seems
the
like we're
seed
stuck.
for more authoritarian approaches to solving the problem. And populist approaches to solving the problem is no different in Latin America.
And we'll also just have to mention what's taking place to the big neighbor to the north, and the president making his mentions of, some people say they like a dictator, and militarizing Washington D.C., whose crime rates have been continually dropping. But it's the worst city in the world. It's worse than Bogota, and all of these things that he puts up there. And you're like, it just makes me shudder.
It is true, because Bukele has the highest approval rate across the region. Of any leader in the region.
Yeah,
and that is
dissident voices are being
very much.
Totally. And I do think there's an instinct, like kind of what we're saying a little bit about extortion. People want to know that they'll eat, to know that their days are in some way predictable, and widespread organized crime stops you knowing you'll progress. And the other thing with extortion is, if your business starts to do well, there's somebody who's going to notice, and they're going to come by. So your ability to grow and exceed and take the opportunities, and social mobility is one thing. I'm always very pro people who don't take the opportunities, who don't manage to socially mobilize, still being heavily supported by the state. I'm not so much like there ought to be opportunities that people can grab, so much as like, let's lift everybody up from the bottom, and we need a strong state to do that. Colombia's discourse around poverty, I mean, anecdote from my first year in Medellin, I went to a yoga class, and the yoga teacher said, if you're born poor in Antioquia, that's not your fault. If you die poor in Antioquia, that's on you. This is a yoga class. A person who is supposedly educated in the sort of, tantric, in the non-sexual ways of the Far East, and here we are with like aggressive neoliberal discourse in your downward dog. And I'm finding that is like a part of maybe Colombian culture. I haven't lived for anywhere near the amount of time I've lived here in other countries of the region, but that demonization of poverty as a personal failure and criminality as an inherent trait of a person rather than a response to poverty is a cultural problem that we have in politics here, right?
And it's a very convenient excuse to justify why the state doesn't do more, because it's your responsibility. Yeah.
I'm imagining the downward dog listening to this and just choking.
I was like, I'm not managing to do my warrior breath in any meaningful way here, because I think I'm having a panic attack about the place I've just moved to, because that's not. I would almost rather be hearing about crystals and the universe than neoliberalism while I'm trying to do my yoga. But talking of yoga classes in Medellin, and I think this is a reasonable segue.
Yes,
we should talk about us. Yes.
Gentrification.
Why are there yoga classes?
I was saying this is a segue
like
too.
Yeah,
gentrification,
and
of course, Medellin being the image for Colombia on that.
Right, and
it's
Nicolas
happening
has
everywhere,
done loads
of course,
of interesting research
but
on this.
It's the image,
because it's happening everywhere.
Yeah,
the what we could call currency privilege, digital nomadism, is contributing to these dynamics. Mexico City is the big example, but Nicolas, you've been looking at Buenos Aires as well, right?
Yes, I had a piece around the protest in Mexico, in particular, Buenos Aires, of course. I looked into it while writing about Mexico. I think what's interesting about gentrification is we tend to blame the digital nomads, okay? But I don't think you should blame yourself for that process.
I will say, I figure myself a foreign correspondent and part of an older, more noble demographic. And I think Matt DeSalvo calls them Atlanta sock bros, who are socks and sliders, pulled up socks, board shorts. Don't. Atlanta sock bros. Thank you, Matt DeSalvo. They're a different breed to me, I would like to think. No offense, guys.
Well.
No, they're often blamed, and I think a lot of those protests blame in Mexico in particular. They blame the digital nomads. In Medellin, you've got the same problem. it's true that you've had an influx of digital nomads, especially since the pandemic. Okay, you can't deny that. But gentrification started well before that. And a lot of it in Latin America, I think it's state-led. It's led by local governments, okay? And it is market-driven. So it's state-led. You've got, the municipality. You see it in Medellin. What happened to Comuna 13, okay? The desire to revitalize the area, increasing land value through transportation projects. And there have been studies that have looked at the link between new transport infrastructure and rent prices, okay? And there is a very strong correlation between the two. So, and all these are deliberate acts by local governments to change the sociology of neighborhoods, okay? To go what they would call more upmarket, to revitalize the area, to transform the area, typically, or they would argue for the better. But it means that those communities who live in those spaces, they can't keep up with the increases in the rents. And so they are displaced and they move where? Outside of the city. So that's the first thing. You've got other cities, Valparaiso in Chile, where touristification, or what we call touristification as academic, which is the ability to turn national heritage into a commodity for the benefit of the tourists. Okay, so we curate a historic town center or city center with the purpose of repackaging it so that it would be Instagrammable and it will attract tourism that will bring revenues. Okay, but those town centers, that's where people live. Okay, or that's where people used to live. And because buildings are being refurbished, landlords, they find better value by renting out the accommodation on short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and the like. They will make more money than by renting it to a local for 30 days. And so they too end up being displaced. And you've got those cities that are increasingly segregated, okay, with those who can, foreigners in particular, who live in city centers that have lost of their vibrancy, because the people who made city centers be what they are being displaced away from city centers in settlements wherever they can afford to live. And it's dramatic. It's dramatic. Yeah, Richard.
I mean, as we say, the digital nomads are the latest evolution of this gentrification, and as you said, state-led and market-driven. The visa was put in. These areas are desirable. There is transportation, which obviously Medellin lauds itself about, in particular. But if they just take Chapinero in Bogota, you can't swing a cat without hitting a gringo now. I mean, that's the truth. You just can't. And of course, the French bakeries have sprung up, and then the other things and whatever else, and that's what it is. So what is a solution? I want to ask, because these protests are becoming more commonplace. I mean, we've seen them in Barcelona as well, and I know that New Orleans years ago prohibited Airbnb from the French Quarter because it would ruin the French Quarter altogether, and it would just become a tourism gulch, which it is in its majority. I mean, I still love it, but it's the touristification, as you say. I mean, look at Cartagena. I mean, and that's walled in. I mean, that's walled in. So what can we do?
Cartagena is the most spatially segregated city in Colombia.
Yes.
Okay? Exactly. What can we do? I think it's interesting because an obvious answer could be to say, okay, let's ban Airbnb. And that's what they try to do in Spain. Okay. They try to cancel quite many licenses, Airbnb licenses, hoping to reduce the rent for the locals. Studies that have looked at it, there are very few studies that have looked at it in a Latin American context. But studies that have looked at it globally, they found the effect to be very modest and very localized specifically in areas that are popular with tourists, so city centers type of things. Okay, but the effects are pretty modest. So I don't think banning Airbnb is necessarily the answer. The core of the issue is what? Speculation, rising land value, and insufficient house building. Okay, there is a shortage of places to live in those cities because you've had this significant move away from rural into urban cities, not just in Colombia, because it is in cities that you find economic activities and jobs and more prosperity. But we haven't built the houses for them. Okay, so those who we talk about state capture, who gets hold of the land, the elites, they're going to develop, say, especially segregated housing for the super rich. And you can see new development in Medellin, in Bogota, which are not for the average Colombian, therefore the ones who earn a significant amount of money, okay? Educated abroad or foreigners, okay. But when do we buy houses? When do we build houses for the urban poor? Because the majority of the Colombian or Latino American will be relatively poor, okay? And I think that's the issue, and governments don't do it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm agreeing. You know, I'm not usually one to be applauding the British state or its history, but the tradition of social housing that we have in Europe, and you know these regulations that you now have about affordable housing as part of large development projects in Europe, particularly in the UK. Although they find all these hideous and mad ways of getting around them with special exits for people in the underground floors that they've built for affordable housing and sort of lunatic things that continue this segregation. Colombia doesn't have that. The poorest people in Colombia build their own houses, whereas the poorest people in the UK have always lived in state-built housing or industrial-built housing. Did either of you read Jenny Aaron Smith's new piece in Bloomberg? Highly recommend. Really interesting about a possible solution that is occurring kind of in a market-driven way for these types of temporary, quite luxe, priced for foreigners housing that are not in residential buildings. They are almost repurposed hotels and industrial structures, short-term, nomad focused, really interesting architecture, often really beautiful. I can't remember the name of the photographer on the piece, but really lovely. And these kind of specific responses that are catered to this phenomenon are maybe a way forward or a way out of pricing people out of parts of town or their own homes.
That's right, and we were talking about grassroots communities earlier in the podcast. And when I reviewed the piece on gentrification, there have been attempts in Buenos Aires, in particular, for grassroots communities to take ownership of housing, and so they came together in order to manage social housing themselves, having access to credit in order to build or to renovate houses, and without using any intermediaries. And I think that played a part in enabling them to resist that potential for displacement. In Brazil, you had a number of financial incentives by the government to enable them to live in social housing, especially for low-income families and vulnerable families. In Chile, you've got heritage and conservation zones, where you've got special zones where tourists are not allowed to stay. So you earmark a pool of housing specifically for vulnerable populations or low-income families to try and limit the pressure from gentrification and reduce the potential for displacements. But we probably need a combination of all those initiatives. Really, we can't solve the problem overnight. Gentrification, I think, it's part of a globalized world. Okay, in a way, we should praise the fact that a city like Medellin or Buenos Aires can attract talent from all around the world. Okay, you wouldn't want the opposite to be the case. So I think that's a good thing. The other thing, it clashes with a neoliberal economic policies, where governments take the view you are responsible for your own future. Small state is beautiful. Let's reduce taxes. Let's not charge too much. And let's limit the social programs that we offer to enable you to go up the ladder, the social class ladder, the housing ladder, and any other ladders that enable you to better your lives. And the problem is that, we are right at the intersection of neoliberalism, globalization, and states generally unable in Latin America to raise taxation, raise income to spend on social programs. Whenever Brazil and Mexico, whenever they spent money on social programs, it had a huge impact, positive impact on poverty reduction. And again, there was a piece on Mexico, I think last week, looking back at AMLO's term and how do social programs made a significant positive impact on poverty reduction in Mexico. So when money is spent in a targeted way, it can make a lot of positive impact.
And the question of taxation is such an interesting one because, the digital nomad visa, you're not paying into the society that you're living in. You're a weird floating entity, and sure, you go to restaurants and all of that puts some money into the economy. But it is a bit mad that both rich people making loads of money off of inflated rents are not being taxed extra to pay back into their communities, but also that those of us who are here living much cheaper lives than we would be living in our own countries, that some of that money we save isn't being forced into the local economy.
That's a very good suggestion, I think. Yeah. You're spot on.
Is anyone listening? Anyone?
Yeah.
Anyone out there? I'm happy to pay some money. Yeah. And this is, the interesting model in Cuba is that you have a tourist economy that runs on dollars. And a local economy that runs on local currency. And I'm not saying Colombia becomes Cuba. I'll get arrested or something. But the last people who tried that, it did not turn out that well for. So we're not going to suggest the Cuban model here. But, there is an advantage in understanding monetary inequality and harnessing it for the local community. But like you say, Nicolas, I think the political will and the entrenched economic models just aren't open to that right now.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of a few other, examples, and far be it for me to praise President Correa in Ecuador, but the social projects that he brought in did over time yield, obviously, a lift out of poverty for many people, and indeed education for others, which allowed again for another social dynamic until of course we saw all the other issues occurring. But it was you did see them. You can chart this, and if I'm not mistaken, was it Lisbon all those years ago that was offering massive tax rebates for young couples to move back into the city center, and they put in schools. They put in places to improve. I don't know, but Nicolas, you'll know better than me on that.
They had a golden visa. If you invest 500,000 euros into real estate, they would give you a visa and tax exemptions.
Okay,
Italy,
so that's different.
Italy or Spain had a scheme to bring families into small villages that are losing their population. And I think Italy had a scheme for people, they could live rent-free, I think, or they could buy small houses for £1 or €1 or whatever currency. But then it was for you to renovate them. Okay, and they were in specific part of the country where very few people lived as people moved towards cities. So there are some interesting schemes, and I think if there is a will, there is a way. And I think the examples we discussed before in Brazil, in Mexico, and in Ecuador show that if you manage to raise taxes, okay, that's the first thing you need to do. Out of those who can pay them, so the wealthy, property owners. I mean, property in Colombia, I don't think it's taxed very much. And it would generate, or at least those who benefit from the tourist economy, okay? So a tax on Airbnb, plus, then you can use that income in order to...
I've just got to cut in and say that Airbnb is on the boycott list. Anyone who might know what I'm talking about will know what I'm talking about. But there's other reasons to sack off Airbnb. Also booking.com. I know that makes it harder, but let's be direct with our hotels if we can.
All Colombians use booking.com. They find it the most convenient. None of them know how it works. And then I explain to them later, I pay 16% or 18% commission on
Ring
that.
Richard directly is what I meant by that.
Well, there's a 10% discount anyone who goes directly through our website. There you go.
There you go.
Some nice things. But it's yes, it's a hard one, isn't it? These are hard issues. As you say, if there's a will, there's a way. I think back to, again, far be it for me to praise him, but I remember when Ken Livingstone was mayor of London and he brought in a lot of that mandate for poor, let's say, the low-income housing in the new builds and so on and so forth. But I remember downtown Bogota, on the edge of the La Candelaria, there's 2 or 3 huge towers that they built right next to Los Andes University. And the idea was that those would be for students. And that's the reason they got the permit to build these huge, colorful towers up there, which looks like it's got the cladding of Grenfell on it, in fact. But I haven't investigated that enough. But at the same time, but then they got away with it by only giving the bottom few floors to students, and the rest was sold as luxury. So,
This is what I meant with the special entrances and exits.
Yeah.
We end up with upstairs, downstairs again, and not in like a fun Julian Fellows way, in a social inequality way. I know. Is some of this, or it feels to me like a lot of this relates to, and this is a drum I'm always banging, the arrival of the internet and the failure of governments to adequately respond to the various ways in which they needed to re-regulate things. Airbnb is obviously a major example of this. Digital nomads are a phenomenon born of the internet. Is a part of this just a failure of agility on the part of policymakers?
It's a hard one. The internet has changed a lot of things. In a way, if you want to regulate the internet, you're going to say, we want free speech. We want to be able to do whatever we want online. Even if you realize that whenever you access the internet, you're not anonymous. Okay? We can always retrieve you. You've got an IP address. From your IP address, we know whenever you use a website, you have to identify yourself using a verified email address and the rest of it. So on the internet, we're not anonymous. Well, we're no longer anonymous.
No, it's the town square. I suppose my issue is more with the freedom of enterprise that has come with the internet that is unregulated, and they're scrambling to catch up. We're talking the gig economy, which is widening inequality, which is taking advantage of people's economically vulnerable situation. Airbnb, which is causing, accelerated gentrification. The kind of the business regulations around the internet seem to me to be failing in the regard of equality.
It's a hard one. I don't have the answer to that. I think because the internet is also what promotes free enterprise. Yes. Okay, and it generates economic activity. We do. If you look at the jobs that depend on the internet, the share of GDP that depend on the internet, and moving forward, AI and the rest of it. It's a fantastic enabler. I think one of the problems is that we've got dominating platforms, all US based, okay, all American, really. Europe in that space doesn't even count.
Really?
They've got, a lot of them have monopolistic positions, so they can charge whatever they want. So yes, you can use another short-term rental platform, but chances are you're going to turn to Airbnb because you've got the biggest choice. You're going to go for Booking because everybody is on Booking. Okay, you're going to use Google. Okay, and I think here there is a failure to do something about those dominant positions, which means those companies extract more out of individuals in terms of privacy, fees, out of entrepreneurs like you, Richard. Commissions on booking and listing fees and the rest of it, Uber and the like when it comes to transportation. I mean, everything is in the power of a small number of US-based organizations. And I think that is bad. Whether it means regulating the internet as such, I'm not sure I would want that. I think it's already...
I certainly wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly.
The business side of the internet, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I did a quite technical, probably too technical podcast on the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act a couple of years ago, which are major new pieces of EU legislation which aimed to slightly pull apart some of these companies, because we have laws about monopolies in these countries that we're talking about, which simply, because of effectively the hegemony of the Chicago School of Economics, have been ignored for decades, and were ignored in the crucial decades leading up to the explosion of the internet, which meant we were totally unprepared to protect economies and industries from monopolies. I feel like we've gotten off topic of urbanization. Sorry, maybe I need more coffee. But it all feels relevant.
Just a thought I had, which actually we can maybe use it as a way to conclude. I think a lot of the problems we have in Latin America, a lot of them would not necessarily be solved, but we would better the lives of people in Latin America if we had more economic growth. And when you look at what happened between 2002 and 2010, we've had a huge, significant, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people dropped out of poverty on the back of economic growth and the commodity boom. And then since the mid-2010, it stagnated. And then came the pandemic, where the people with the lowest income, the most vulnerable people, suffered most from the pandemic because informal employment suddenly came to nothing. And if we find a way to go back to economic growth in Latin America, and I need to write a piece on this and research it in my Substack, because what we need in Latin America is economic growth. Only economic growth is going to grow the pie for everybody. And if the pie grows for everybody in Latin America, you're going to have more economic activity, more opportunities for employment. You're going to have less criminality. Studies show whenever you've got a 1% increase in GDP, homicide rate come down 0.24. So you've got an inverse correlation between GDP, economic growth, and criminality, which we can explain easily. So the more we're going to provide opportunities for people in Latin America, the better off people will be, the more secure, the more safe, the safer, the more prosperous Latin America will be. What's happening, what has been happening since 2010, 2015, doesn't have to be the way it is, okay? We need to find again the route, the way out of stagnation, having taken a hit during the pandemic, back to growth. How do we make it happen? Yeah, I don't know. I need to research it.
We need more than an hour.
Now we solve some of the problems we've been discussing for the past hour.
Well, honestly, I think we could go on for hours and hours. Certainly. Because this is fascinating. And I expect if we went on for hours, Nicolas, you would solve the problems. You would have the answer.
If it was that easy.
Can I just take this moment? I think we should wind down here because we're going on, but it's phenomenal. And I think we could pick up at another date later down the line when you have your book out.
When my book is out, that's right.
What is the title?
So it's going to be around business and social justice in Latin America. So looking at the intersection of business with human development, social progress, and economic progress in Latin America.
This hits my sweet spot. This is the sort of thing I geek out on. So please keep us informed as to when this comes.
I will send you a free copy.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And we can go through not through Amazon then. I won't say anything more. Emily, have you got any final comments?
No, thank you so much for coming on, Nicolas. This has been
pleasure. Nice to meet you, Emily.
You too.
It's
nice
been
to connect with you, Richard.
Yeah, an absolute pleasure to talk to Nicolas Forsans, who is the professor at University of Essex, Latin America specialist. Book coming out soon, as you heard. He's focused on political economy, migration, and the business, the sort of intersection between business and social justice. Watch out for his book. This has been a truly fascinating episode. I've enjoyed it very much. I know I can speak for Emily there as well. And Nicolas, Have a great rest of the week, and I look forward to checking back in of Latin America Sin Filtro on Substack. I always enjoy when the updates come through. Maybe I'll subscribe, a paid subscription.
Thank you, Richard.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Emily.